right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining the breakdown. This is episode number 3. I'm James Sayer, your host. This is a special live episode where we're going to discuss life on lockdown and what life has been like during COVID-19 for people in the ministry. What it's like to minister to people during COVID-19. And my special guest today is Annie Sayer, who is associate pastor at Saddle Rock Presbyterian Church in Wenatchee, Washington. Full disclosure, she is also one of my younger sisters. So thanks, Annie, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, James.
Well, you're welcome. So you're an associate pastor at the Saddle Rock Church in Wenatchee, Presbyterian Church in Wenatchee, Washington. So what's it been like since the shutdown?
Yeah, it was interesting. You kind of have your church calendar and you kind of have your approach to ministry. And then just like everybody in every line of work, it all got thrown up in the air with the COVID shutdown. So for a church that has really not ventured much before this into technology or different online portals for ministry, all of a sudden within the course of a week or two, we were teaching people how to do small groups on Zoom and figuring out how to live stream a service. And then after we went through that live streaming phase, when we weren't able to have anyone in the congregation coming to service, then we shifted into the mode of, okay, how do we pre-record elements of a service and then edit them all together to make a cohesive worship experience for people online. So it's just been, for like everybody else, a time of lots of learning and deep dive into some technology that we weren't familiar with before. And along with that, grappling with different people's political views and how that plays into their attitude toward the shutdown itself. So it's been a really interesting time dealing with, on the one hand, lots of technical issues and working the technology to try to keep the ministry thriving and help people connect with one another. But then also dealing with very human issues of grief and loss and anger and all of that. So it's been quite a ride.
So what you're hearing from your congregation, I guess they're emailing you a lot and you're Zooming with them. You're not having in-church services, correct?
Right. We're not having services in the church. There's been a fair bit of email. What's been interesting is, phone calls had really fallen by the wayside for a lot of people. But that's another thing that we've experienced is all of a sudden we're discovering that our phones can make phone calls again. So right. that has been a way of staying in connection with people. And what we're hearing is all across the board. We've got people who have underlying health conditions or are elderly, and so are really scared and fearful of the risk of COVID. And then we've got people on the other side who haven't bought into the risk at all, don't think that this is a valid concern, and are angry and frustrated at the level of the shutdown. And so pushing for us to even in some cases flout Governor Inslee's orders and go ahead and start meeting in person again. So there's just a real range of feelings out there, and trying to help all of them not be stuck in that reactive mode of just what their gut is telling them, whether it's that fight or flight kind of response, but helping people to see what God might be doing in the midst of a situation like this, and what are the spiritual lessons we can take away from it.
So a lot of frustration, a lot of confusion, very different opinions, I guess, about the shutdown and how it's being handled. A very challenging situation, I guess, in many respects. Now, your job before the shutdown, comparing the shutdown to pre, what are the differences? Like, obviously, you're not doing the live services and things like that in the actual building itself, but you are still doing sermons, right, and services online that people can
Right.
can go to. So they still have this
Yeah.
virtual relationship that's still there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel a loss of personal connection with the congregation because I'm not seeing them every week, not getting a chance to hear what's going on and pray with them in person directly the way that I'm used to. But it's been interesting for me, the folks on the other end who are watching our services and taking all this content in online. I think some of them are still really feeling that same or a very similar level of connection because I'm in their living room. Or, Pastor Dennis, our main preaching pastor, he's in their living room every week. And so they almost feel a greater intimacy with us because now we've been brought into their homes. But for us, it's just the opposite. They can see us. They're seeing us on the screen. They're reading newsletter articles that we're putting out weekly, trying to encourage them and keep them focused on their relationship with God. But we're not having that same experience back from them. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon.
It is interesting. Well, here's another question for you. Now you have like outreach programs or like charity programs with the community. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have a lot of good connections here with ministries in Wenatchee that work with the homeless or families at risk of homelessness. Yeah.
So how has that been since the shutdown? How have your efforts been during the last 3 and 4 months?
Yeah, it was really great. When the shutdown first happened, our youth pastor, realized we weren't going to be able to have our normal youth group gatherings that we are used to having every week. But he knew that Lighthouse Ministries, our local homeless ministry, was really in need of more volunteer support for their food distribution, especially. And so, whereas the youth director couldn't be having kids come to the church and, play games and do Bible study together, he was able to get some of the youth families involved with him going down 3-4 times a week to serve in distributing food. So that connection was really strengthened. And our local missions team as a whole, which is kind of the committee in the church, which really nurtures our relationship with these other ministries in the community, they were very diligent in looking for opportunities to give more financial support to ministries that were ramping up their work. So that's been really good to see. And one of the main ministries that we've partnered with a lot through the years, Serve Wenatchee Valley, has seen an incredible increase in giving through this. They were able to partner with a couple other entities in the community and just hugely ramp up their food distribution efforts every week. And we just saw lots and lots of people who hadn't been involved in that work before suddenly giving and giving very generously to that work. So the whole, not just the church, but I think the whole community has really mobilized because they recognize, with the skyrocketing unemployment, so many families that weren't vulnerable before, all of a sudden were in this position. And so it's been great to see people come together to try to meet those needs.
So there's this spirit of community. There's like a greater sense of we're in this together, and people are, I guess, like you said, there's an increase in giving. Is that correct? That there's actually an uptick in the amount that's being given? Is that
It's
correct?
amazing. Yeah, I mean, I saw it's such an interesting time because on the one hand, you've got families that are feeling economically vulnerable, maybe for the first time. But then on the other hand, you've got families who received this stimulus check from the federal government and we're saying, we don't need this, who can benefit from this because we certainly don't need it. There was an older gentleman in our congregation who reached out to me and said, my wife and I got this check from the government. We're very comfortable. We don't need it. Is there another family in the church that you know of that could use this money? And so just really awesome to see people thinking of others like that.
That really is. So what are you hearing now about lifting of the restrictions for Washington?
Yeah, so our county has been really behind. It's been frustrating for folks here in Central Washington to see the counties on the west side of the state with a much larger population advancing through the governor's phases more quickly. And that simply has to do with the math of the rate of infection. So we've got a much smaller population, and so it doesn't take that many cases to tip the scales against us. But just this week, we were approved to move into what they're calling phase 1.5, which loosens things a little bit for some businesses. And even before that happened, the governor had kind of come to a compromise solution. I think some faith leaders had been, we had one or two pastors here in Wenatchee who had been party to a lawsuit against the governor trying to get the power for reopening our county placed in local hands rather than in the state. So I don't know if that was happening in other parts of the state too, and the governor finally decided it was worth finding a compromise solution. But anyway, last week they came out and said that in Washington, churches could have in-person gatherings of up to 100 people as long as they were outdoors with the 6 feet social distancing and face masks. So we're slowly getting there, and it's interesting in our congregation. We've got such a variety of political views and just emotional reactions to that. You've got people on the one hand saying, great, yes, let's go for it. If they're letting us meet outside, let's do it. Let's take this opportunity. Other people saying, great, let's do it. Why would we need to wear face masks outside? That's stupid. Why are we complying with something that's nonsense? And then we've got still some people who are saying, I still don't feel safe, and I don't know when I'm going to feel safe coming back to church and being in a large group again. So just all across the board, and you get pressure from both sides. So it's definitely one of those times where you see the truth of the saying that you can please some of the people some of the time, but you can't please all the people all the time. And if you're a person in leadership who really needs that sense of being liked and having the approval of all the people, that is not the time for this kind of mentality.
Because you're not going to get that.
Not going to happen. Nope. It's a time that you really have to live by your convictions and stick to your guns and be consistent. And I've told a couple folks in the congregation, we're having to make so many decisions all the time. And it's not just church leadership. It's people who are responsible for others in all different segments of society. You're constantly adjusting to the news. You're constantly adjusting to a new order from the governor and figuring out what that means for your people. And sometimes the best thing and the thing that leads to clarity in the midst of chaos is simply to make a decision and stick with it. Even if you're not sure it's the best decision, just having that closure and letting people know what the plan is, I think, can bring a sense of peace in the midst of what really has been a time of chaos and uncertainty.
No, absolutely. Speaking of chaos, a whole new wrinkle to all of this are the protests that have been going on for the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
After the killing of George Floyd. So have you heard anything from the community? What are you seeing in Wenatchee?
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard comments from people and from faith leaders about the protests?
Yeah, it's interesting. There hasn't been, at least not that I'm aware of, I haven't seen a broad conversation among faith leaders in Wenatchee about the civil unrest and, just the lack of racial reconciliation and racial justice. I've seen community-wide expressions. We've had protests here in Wenatchee. There was a vigil held on Monday night in memory of George Floyd. And our church is part of a larger denomination called the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. And our denominational leadership called us to a day of lament, prayer, and fasting on Monday. And our church did participate in that. And normally when we have a special prayer gathering in the church, we might get 5 or 6 people, maybe 10 on a good day. And so I was really encouraged on Monday. We had noontime prayer. The idea was if you're fasting and praying, then come during your lunchtime and have a time of prayer together instead of eating your lunch. And we had about 16 people show up, which is which is a lot more than I was expecting. So that was encouraging to see, just praying for justice, praying for greater racial reconciliation in our country, and praying for healing. It was very encouraging to see. And I think we've got obviously a long way to go. This isn't a one and done sort of thing. But I do see a willingness among the people in our church to learn and listen from the experiences of others and see how we can be a part of that healing. We think that that's part of the kingdom work of God, where, you know, one day we expect to see people from every tongue, tribe, and nation worshiping the Lord together. And so we want to be a part of bringing the gospel to people, no matter what background they have, no matter what neighborhood they grew up in, and together living as God's people. So.
No, that's a very encouraging message, and it's nice to hear that your congregation is concerned and is, you know, praying about, you know, racial reconciliation and racial justice in this country. Obviously, it's a very serious problem that has not been sufficiently addressed.
No, got a long way to go.
Long way. Sort of going off of that now, one of your previous jobs, you worked in a prison ministry, is that correct?
A county jail. Yep.
County jail. How long did you do that for?
I was there, I think it was just about 2 years. It wasn't a very long period of time, and then we had our first child, and so I stayed home for a while. But yeah, it was about 2 years working in a jail ministry.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about that, what that was like, and what were your observations from that time?
Oh, sure. Well, it was a brand new experience to me. I went into the jail to be the executive director of a nonprofit Christian organization working within the walls, providing not only religious services and Bible studies, but also addiction recovery, educational programs, counseling. And I had before that never set foot in a jail or a prison before. So I was green, very green, had no idea what I was getting myself into. And the first impression I had walking into that space was that I was walking into an environment that was intentionally classist. There were two classes of people within these walls that I spent, 40 plus hours a week in. There were people wearing the jumpsuits, who had no freedom, who were not in control, who were behind bars. And then there were those of us who would drift in and out by choice, who had our freedom, who could get around the building wherever we wanted. And that was a really eerie feeling to me. I had never been in an environment like that before. And seeing the impact of being on lockdown on people was really sobering. You take these adults, adult human beings, and seeing them in an environment that was so restricted, so I want to say undignified. The jail that I served in was not a bad place. They had decent living conditions, but it's the difference between living in the free world and being in an institution in which you have no freedom. It has a real impact on people. And when you put them in an environment like that, there aren't many people for whom that's going to bring out the best. So you see a huge just regression in behavior. It's almost like you're dealing with the elementary school kid who just wants to cause trouble in class, but you've got 800 of them in one building. So it was a really strange environment for me to get used to. But one thing I've learned about human beings is we can get used to just about anything. And so you adapt and you figure out what it takes to get along there. I remember one of the first decisions I had to make, being a female in that environment, was just grappling with my own personality. I, by nature, am a very smiley person. I enjoy people. And so I'm pretty much always happy to see a person. And I just automatically smile when I see another human being. And when I went to work in the jail, I had to think about, what message am I possibly sending by smiling at the, vast majority of inmates who were male? There were only about 10% of the population that was female in this particular facility. What risk am I creating? What am I getting myself into? And I just decided, I went into that place as a representative of Jesus Christ and wanting to convey his love and convey the value of each human being in there. And so I just decided I'm just going to be myself. I'm going to smile at people when I want to smile at them. I'm not going to be self-conscious about it. I'm not going to be stupid. I want to be wise, but just figuring out what it looked like to be me and bring the message that I wanted to bring as a Christian into that place while realizing the uniqueness of the environment. So.
Sounds like a very unusual work environment, and
Yes.
but a very fascinating and probably in many ways a rewarding work experience.
It really was.
That's not a job many people are going to have. That's not a world that most people ever see.
Yeah.
Fortunately.
It was eye-opening for me, for sure. And I quickly became aware of my own areas where I was naive. Talking with inmates, especially, I served as a chaplain to the female inmates, and at least once a week, I would make myself available in the law library. Any female inmate that wanted to come and talk or be prayed for would come, and in those conversations, I just realized how sheltered of a life I had lived. Not that someone was sheltering me, but just my experiences were so limited. And so many of the folks behind bars have had backgrounds and family histories completely unlike anything I could ever imagine. And so learned a lot about a world that I just had no contact with before.
So you said you were naive.
Yeah.
So you were obviously, if you're not exposed to a culture or an institution,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're not going to be able to have that type of knowledge, that understanding. But
right.
You have to spend 2 years working in this system. And were there any takeaways as far as like dealing with the prison population, whether it be the males or the females, that you got from working with them about like what were they going to do when they got out? Did they have a chance?
Right.
Were there encouraging signs that you saw, or were the systemic issues like so overwhelming that it was almost like hope crushing? What were your impressions from those 2 years?
I'll be honest, all the systemic issues were pretty overwhelming, and it was just toward the end of my time with that organization that we started to really work on developing reentry programming. All of our services up to that point were really focused on, okay, this is a county jail. People are going to be here for a matter of weeks, months, maybe in some extreme cases, a year or more. The ideal in a county jail is, people are waiting there for trial and then they're going to move on from there, either going to be released or they're going to do the rest of their time in one of the state prisons. So we really wanted to focus on the urgent things that we could deal with during this short period of time. And especially, the problem of drug addiction is so huge in any jail or prison. You want to take advantage of the clean time that has been foisted onto these folks. This might be the first time in years that they're not in an altered state and they don't have access to drugs and alcohol. So we really wanted to focus on that moment, that crisis moment that could serve as a turning point. But towards the end of my time, we did start to look at and start talking with other organizations in that community about how we could help position people for reentry into the community. And it was interesting because, again, the organization dealt with spiritual needs, addiction recovery, education programs, job readiness. We were trying to address all these different issues, and different staff and volunteers. Of course, everybody thinks that what they do is most important. So I came in really thinking, okay, drug addiction is an issue, poverty is an issue. We need to help these people be ready for a job so that they can afford a good life and move out of the neighborhoods they were in, start forging some new relationships. But my addiction recovery manager was like, Annie, if you give an addict a job, all you've done is just given him more money to use. You have to address the addiction. And that was really good insight that he shared with me. It helped me understand the hold that addiction has over people. And there's in the psychological community, they talk about co-occurring disorders. And so you can have more than one thing going on at a time. So you might have an addiction to meth, but you also might have schizoaffective disorder or bipolar disorder that hasn't been treated. And so, a lot of addicts begin because they're trying to medicate themselves and trying to deal with issues by numbing the pain. So I guess all that is to say, it was overwhelming to think about all the different interrelated issues that folks were dealing with, but it just showed me the real value of a holistic approach to getting people reestablished. And they talk a lot about rehabilitation in working with inmates or prisoners. And again, our addiction recovery manager would say, we're not talking rehabilitation. These people were never habilitated to begin with. Like you need to start from the ground up. So that was very eye-opening for me. And I just see there's a lot of work that needs to be done at every level of society to help people overcome struggles, not only of poverty and drug addiction, but psychological issues. There were a lot of folks behind bars who would have been much better served in a residential psychological facility or a drug treatment center. So it's complicated.
Well, we'll see what happens with all this talk of defunding the police, which I'm not the greatest actual slogan to use, but the idea that really behind
Shifting.
It being that you reallocate some of the resources that have been given to police for so long,
mm-hmm.
and dedicate it to like more social service providing or more psychological services,
right?
Where it's more appropriate, instead of just throwing people in jail who really, where treatment is going to be more effective and more appropriate.
Yes.
So that'll be an interesting thing to see how that plays out, because you're talking about, that's a lot of money. And I don't see how we're going to do that without spending more money. That's going to require, I mean, we're going to still have to maintain police forces.
Right.
We're not going to be able to scrap them, even if we do take some money away and give it to a mental health, agency or some other like agencies dealing that are going to take on these other issues.
Right.
But it seems like that's going to require additional funding on top of what already exists. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out funding wise.
Yeah.
It's going to be different, I guess, for every state and locality. But definitely
Absolutely.
an idea, I think, whose time has come. So
I agree. Yeah. I think, our approach to criminal law enforcement and criminal justice to a great degree has been a Band-Aid. And now people are saying, okay, the Band-Aid isn't working. How can we address the deeper issues here? So I hope that we can see some meaningful change. And I hope that the faith community can be a part of that. I know there are some prominent pastors who have been for decades already calling for prison reform and very much wanting to see these kind of changes happen. And I'm hoping now in this moment that we're in as a country that we'll see even more faith leaders have their eyes opened to these areas where we really need to grow and shift our approach. And it's not only for the good of the folks who would be better addressed in treatment versus in a prison or a jail, but it's for the good of our whole society. We're not in a healthy place when you look at the rate of imprisonment, and especially when you look at the racial disparities there. That should be a wake-up call for all of us. And if we can improve in this area and make some real decisive changes, that's going to benefit all of us. It's going to benefit generations of kids who maybe they will grow up knowing their dads, knowing their parents, and being able to have a whole family instead of what's been going on, especially in a lot of the major cities for decades.
where you have the one parent, usually the father's in jail, so there's a mother struggling to raise the children,
Mm-hmm.
and that, you know, is always a challenge, especially if you're already struggling with poverty.
Right.
uh, Hard enough already with two parents, but you have one in jail, and uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's just a cycle of it just repeats itself.
It
And
does, and it has a real impact on children's self-image and their sense of dignity when the most influential adults in their lives are caught in this cycle of, you know, addiction, imprisonment, all of these sorts of things. That it has an impact on the way they view their future and their possibilities.
right, and here's a thought too, is that a lot of folks say, and this used to be something a lot of white people used to say too, to you know, blacks complaining about, you know, rightfully complaining about the system, and the fact that, you know, so many black people were being incarcerated at such a high rate
Mm-hmm.
for crimes that white people would not go to jail for. Like
Mm-hmm.
you would have a white kid in the suburbs who gets busted for, you know, possession of marijuana, he gets a slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
And similar thing happens to uh, a black kid in the inner city. He goes to jail. You know, he
Mm-hmm.
goes to jail for months or even years.
And just sets his life on a whole different trajectory. Yeah.
Right. So here's the thing too, is that if you have one parent who's incarcerated, I mean, that's one parent. It's not just the income, right? It's not just
Right.
playtime with daddy. It's
Yeah.
also that involvement with the parent, that, you
Mm-hmm.
know, that development that you have. You know, it's thwarted, and it's stunted because they've taken one of your parents away,
Yeah.
right? And so it's like, I'm supposed to learn from my dad. I'm supposed to learn this stuff from him, but you've taken him from me. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like we talk about the importance of education, and the importance of, right, pulling yourself up from, you know, with your bootstraps, you know, the self-reliance. But the truth is, I mean, I think research shows this, that the children who do the best, you know, academically, are the ones whose parents are involved
Yeah.
in their children's learning and their academic journey. And that's really
Mm-hmm.
not possible when you have, you know, one parent who's working and the other parent who's in jail.
Right.
That's just not an option. So that's like immediately another huge disadvantage right
Mm-hmm.
from the beginning. And so
It
what
just
this whole
compounds from there.
systemic thing that they've been talking about, that it goes throughout the entire society, and it doesn't touch just one thing. It doesn't just
Right.
affect the prison system or the judicial system, right, or police. It affects every aspect
Mm-hmm.
of minorities' lives.
That's
And I mean,
right.
obviously, the black community highlighted here with all the high profile videos of police
Mm-hmm.
abuse, but we know this has been a problem, you know, for minorities for years,
Yes.
not just blacks. And that actually, I mean, you know, it's an issue for poor whites as well. It's not just,
Mm-hmm.
it's you know, that there's police brutality against white people too,
Mm-hmm.
and there are poor white people that are also not well served.
That are disadvantaged. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's true.
that is true as well. But, you know, it doesn't change the fact that this, you know,
We have
persistent
a
racism has always
right.
been.
Yes, we have a deep, deep, deep and long-standing cultural undercurrent of racism against Black and Brown people in this country. That just cannot be denied.
So, and we haven't moved past it yet, but it's encouraging that at least it's being faced more directly than it has
Yes.
been
Yeah,
in a long time. So,
that's
any
right.
other thoughts before we end the show? Any other thoughts that you'd like to say or leave us
I
with?
just my sincere hope for the people in our church is the same hope that I have for our whole country after going through this COVID shutdown and now this wake up call with regard to racial justice. Um, I hope that we'll be patient enough to learn the lessons that are to be learned during this time, and not to be so eager to get back to normal that we forget these things that we've learned in a moment of pause and more introspection. So let's not let the moment pass us by. Let's make sure that we reap what we should from this and are able to improve and grow and become more compassionate and empathetic toward our neighbors.
That sounds like good advice to me. Well, thank you very much, Annie, for joining us today. Annie Rose,
Pleasure.
again, she's associate pastor at the Saddle Rock Presbyterian Church in Wenatchee, Washington. And if you're curious where that is, it's about, 2.5 hours east of Seattle.
That's right.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yep.
So thank you again, Annie, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Our next episode will be on the social contract. So I look forward to discussing that with you soon. Thanks a lot and take care. Bye-bye.